Hey all, thanks for tuning in. It is Thursday, May 14th. We are continuing our series of conversations about revival, what that looks like, particularly revival in our homes and cars and kitchens because we're not able to meet together as a church. It's an important conversation to discuss what revival can and should look like and the aspects of it. Next week, we will be talking about some other aspects of revival, but I've been allowed to lead the conversations for this week. So thanks, guys, for humoring me. Today, I wanted to talk about a concept that I think is gaining traction in culture with regard to revival, and I think it makes it harder for revival to happen. And it kind of came to mind when I am reading this book called The Gospel in a Pluralist Society, right here by Leslie Newbigin. A real barn burner. I know everybody's just going to go right out and buy it. It's very good. It's very thoughtful, and it takes a lot of time to think through and digest. This guy was a missionary in India, and he came back to the United Kingdom, and he realized, like in India, one of the things they had to deal with is like people are more than happy to accept Jesus, and they just add him to their pantheon of gods. So they've got, just bunches of gods, and then you just put Jesus right in there with all of that. And so one of the things, the battles he had to deal with is like, how do you help people understand that, no, it is only Jesus. Jesus is the only way. And of course, Steve, you've dealt with that a little in Thailand. I know my parents did in Taiwan as well. You just add Jesus to the little family altar at home, and they're fine with it. He said when he came back to the United Kingdom that he realized it was basically the same thing there, despite the fact that it was a vastly different culture, but that people had kind of accepted a relativism or a pluralism. And the general idea, the difference wasn't that you just added Jesus to a pantheon of gods. The difference is that you said, well, Jesus is fine for you. He's true for you, but it's not true for me. And it's such a tricky concept when you start talking about relativism, because it sounds good or it sounds appealing. One of the phrases that I just cannot stand that you hear all the time is when people say something like, well, that is my truth. And I'm just like, it's just so hard for me. And I don't know, maybe this is because of my age, but truth is not subjective or truth, it's objective. There is like truth. And I realize, maybe I like a certain flavor of ice cream, is subjective, but what's the tallest mountain isn't. It's an objective truth. So let me ask you guys this before I continue to dominate the conversation. Where do you see relativism pop up in your ministries as an outreach minister, Steve, and as a youth minister, Caleb? Where are you kind of seeing the concept spring up in your different work?
Steve, I'll let you go first.
All right.
You guys are so polite. You're always letting the guy go.
In outreach, it's so if discipleship and outreach. So if I'm talking with a non-Christian, then their background is going to be the determining factor of that. Do they follow those views? It's like the class we did on Wednesday nights with significant others, our non-Christian neighbors, introducing them to Christ, because Christ is, I am the only way. I'm the way, the truth, and life, and no one comes to the Father except through me. So getting that across to people sounds bad. Sounds, so you're being prideful about that. Like you said, and then this tolerance, this, all roads lead to God kind of culture that maybe we're living in. And I'll be interested to hear what you say about that, Caleb, as far as the young people, the Generation Z or whatever. That it sounds good, but it's in reality, the outcomes of that kind of acceptance is not good, because then there is no truth. There is no right. There is no wrong. It's all dependent on a person's feelings in the moment. And so it gives us some hurdles when you're trying to talk to someone. Mm-hmm. In the same way, we've met Christians, we've met believers who have accepted at least part of that sometimes.
Yes.
And so then you have a hurdle there as well
Well, so one of the things I've noticed with a lot of Christians is that there's kind of a shrugging of the shoulders with regard to other ideas or religions, because tolerance is it is a valuable virtue in some areas. And so, people are encouraged to pursue tolerance, but then when tolerance sometimes comes at the expense of truth. And so I think people are kind of like, well, they follow some other God, or they, hey, that works for them. They seem to be happy. And what I've seen shifting is that happiness or, personal fulfillment becomes the objective standard for truth. It's true if it makes me personally happy, rather than the fact that it's actually true. And then happiness is so tricky and fleeting. And, are you really happy? Are you temporarily happy? There's all kinds of issues with that. Anyway, Caleb, where are you seeing that with youth ministry?
Yeah, I think this idea of relativism, it's pervasive in just the lives of our teenagers and of our kids. High schools and junior highs, they are these tough, kind of like these battlegrounds of competing ideologies. I know we like to think of that as the college. That's true, and you hear that from colleges most because they can vocalize this, but in our high schools and in our junior highs, these worldviews are interacting of our kids in a subversive manner. It's not like they're being told this is moral relativism. It's just like, this is what you're accepted to do. And I think a lot of teenagers buy into it, or at least aware of it, because it sounds good. It sounds like we should all, this is my truth. And you should have your truth because it's good for you and mine's good for me.
Yeah, it's pragmatic. It works for you, so it's true for you.
And part of it comes. There's this book that I really think all people should read. It's called The Coddling of the American Mind, and it's great. It's by two social psychologists who neither of them are Christians, both are practicing atheists. But it's such a useful book because they are breaking down this kind of idea of moral relativism in Generation Z, and I'm at kind of that borderline of millennial or Gen Z, and it's just this idea that truth is good if it doesn't cause another person harm.
Right.
And so it's this idea where with our teens, like, they care about people. I mean, it comes from a very good nature spot. They care for other people, and so they don't want to cause harm. And usually mental, is perceived, mental harm to this other person by
making them feel like what they believe isn't true.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Interesting. Sorry, I didn't mean to cut you off.
No, you're good. But I mean, that's just kind of idea. It's pretty common. I mean, our teens and our kids might not know the proper academic terminology for all this, but they know the general ideas, because that's the thing in our culture, especially among this younger generation, is that we each have our own truth, and it is good as long as it doesn't cause harm to other people.
Yeah, and we think we know what causes harm or doesn't cause harm, but that's that itself is a subjective guideline. So I think the way that this impacts our topic of revival is that when you start to accept a viewpoint that there are a variety of truths, then it is easier to dismiss conviction. You're not being held to a specific standard that you're falling short of. I mean, sin is relative. Like, it didn't really harm anybody, so what's the real crime? And then I think once people begin using that as a litmus test for sin, well, then it's like, I mean, the ball game's over, because who gets to decide what is harmful? And then why should I feel bad about doing something if I cannot tell that it directly causes somebody else harm? And so I think revival is kind of thrown out the window, because there's no standard that I'm holding myself to or I'm measuring myself against. I mean, it just seems wild to think that Jesus said, I am the way, the truth, and the life. No one comes to the Father but through me. And yet people like Jesus, but they throw out him as sort of an objective standard.
And that just, the problem with that is that it just breeds indifference.
Yes.
If I'm not motivated to change anymore, If truth is relative, I'm not motivated to talk to anybody anymore. Don't know what I would say to them. And then we just have this, it's not actually a good thing, because it just breeds this indifference, and then no one cares anymore.
Yeah.
And so we don't end up caring for one another or caring what our neighbor does, or and that indifference, I think, is one of the things that must change for revival to take place. That's why we need revival, is because we have become indifferent.
Yeah. I agree. And we become indifferent because who cares? It's all relative. What does it matter?
Right.
Yeah. No, I think that I think that there maybe is a flip side to this too, because I think sometimes people, Christians, don't do a good job of differentiating between things that they are allowed to be relative about. I mean, this isn't a great example, but it popped into my head. I have a preaching buddy who was born left-handed, but his dad didn't believe in left-handedness, I guess, when he was born. So he forced him to do everything right-handed. And so it's just kind of like, you can tell everything he does is a little backward, because he's trying to, like, his dad was like, I can't allow you to be left-handed. That's not an objective standard, or, but I think that when it comes to our spirituality, there are things where we can have differences of opinion and thought and approach to Christ, and a way that we engage with Christ. And so Christians do need to be cautious about holding everyone else to their way of engaging with Christ, but that doesn't mean that it's relative. So how would you speak to that kind of that tricky balance of, that we all have different means of growth and things that matter to us and ways that we engage with God? Some people, worship really matters to them, and so the stay-at-home order is really making an impact on them because they don't feel like they can worship together. Other people are they're academic and they just want to read a book about it. How would you speak to that aspect of how we approach Christ differently? How is that different than relativism?
Yeah, I really think that this is an example of where our culture's idea of relativism has impacted our functioning as Christians, our functioning as church. When our culture says you have your own individual truth, and that is what is important to you, and no one else can take it from you. There's the culture saying to person A that your belief is the most important, but that is only for you. And that's what culture says, but that isn't necessarily what happens. When we take that to the church, it looks very differently, in the sense that we might say, I think singing 8 hours every Sunday is the most important aspect. And when we let that become ingrained in us as people, that impacts how we perceive our fellow brothers and sisters in Christ. And so I think one of the things we have to guard ourselves against is remembering that the purpose of our worship and our faith is to glorify Christ, and not to get caught up in maybe a particular method which is influenced by our culture. I don't know if that makes sense or not.
Sure.
Yeah, and so if I understand your question correctly, we're not just talking about this relativism of this umbrella of truth that's over everyone and it's eternal for everyone.
Yeah.
We're talking about a variety or a preference for how we deal with things together. So, when we're talking, I thought of 1 Peter 4:10. I looked it up. God has given each of you a gift from his great variety of spiritual gifts. Use them well to serve one another.
Yeah.
So as far as our preferences in worship or Bible reading, or, so as ministers, we have certain gifts and responsibilities that the rest of the congregation doesn't have. It doesn't mean that they don't have responsibilities. They do, but for one person, it'll be giving. For one person, it'll be compassion. For one person, it'll be grace or love or teaching. And all of that comes together. So that's variety. That's part of God's gifts. That's not relativism as far as truth.
Yeah.
That affects us all the same.
Yeah. I think that's a valuable point to keep in mind, because it is easy for Christians to kind of get off the rails a little bit and feel like they're version of discipleship is.
Yeah, or their focus
Yeah.
of discipleship. It's not everybody's. My focus of discipleship is not going to be everybody's focus on discipleship.
Yeah. Well, I mean, maybe a good example of that is like, as a guy who does quite a bit of preaching, I really think a lot about and value the preaching time in a service, where maybe our song leaders are like, let's sing more songs. And I'm like, no, less songs, more preaching. And those are all different ways of trying to worship God and draw closer to God. Okay, well, we're definitely out of time. We may need to edit some of this conversation out. We'll have to see. But hopefully that is valuable when we think about revival, and we think about, we are holding ourselves to an objective standard of sin and truth, and that God provides an incredible amount of grace. Hopefully you can join us tomorrow. We're going to talk about the idea of being countercultural versus just being outside of culture, and kind of culture as the bad guy in churches sometimes. So hopefully you can join us. Hopefully this is helpful. If it is, let us know. You can email us at staff@Woodbury Church. If it's not, well, keep your opinions to yourself. So they're not objective truth. Anyway, we will talk to y'all later.
All right.